Hey everyone, this is Kei Seto Kaiba, and we are back with another chess video. This time we are talking about the all-important question, what side should you castle in chess? We all know that castling is very important. It helps, get our king to safety, and of course we also develop one of our rooks out the corner, which is also very useful. Sometimes the rooks have a little trouble getting out because of their a bit clumsy moving style. And so because of that, castling is really useful in connecting the rooks and facilitating development. But it's a little bit deeper than that because there's a lot of factors that go into evaluating the pros and cons to castling, and so that's what we're going to take a look at here. So first of all, I want to comment that if both sides were to castle, just normally, and this is just the starting position, all I did was I just took out all the pieces and took out the central pawns for both sides just to make things a little easier so we can illustrate the pros and cons of this. So if both sides were to castle, we can see, well, both kings are safe. Here we have white, very nice row of pawns right in front of their king. Their king is very safe. Same thing with black. They should keep these pawns very close to the king, help offer some kind of protection from checks and all the dangerous pieces, and the game continues. It's pretty logical and straightforward. But something special happens if we castle the other way. So let's go back and we'll show kind of visually what happens if one side castles here and the other side castles the other way. So now we can easier see the benefits and the drawbacks of castling in each direction. So we'll notice here that, of course, white, going queenside, whenever a side goes queenside, almost always, not always, but almost always, it tends to be a little bit more aggressive. Now, why is that? Well, the king here is not as safe. If we look at this diagonal here, if there was any piece there, they could still offer a check, and the king is really not the safest. It would really like to be on b1. And not only that, but it also protects the a2 pawn. If this king is still on c1, a piece could easily take the a2 pawn. So you have to be a little bit careful about that. However, black's position, or whatever side goes king side, they don't have this, because this pawn is not really a problem. The king is already defending it, there's no checks that the king has to worry about. So generally speaking, castling kingside tends to be a little more solid and a little bit safer. Additionally, we'll notice that the rook here is kind of blocked in by its own pawn. And usually it's going to move, something like this and try and get one of the central files. Whereas we see that when one side castles queenside, we already have the rook on a central file. So these are small little details that kind of show the pros and cons of castling here. But this isn't even the biggest thing. The biggest thing has to do with something called home pawns and ranger pawns. So what is a home pawn and what is a ranger pawn? So home pawns are what, not counting central pawns, it is the three pawns that are in front of your castled king. So in this case, these are white's home pawns, and here for black, these are black's home pawns. Now the other pawns on the other flank of the board, these are your ranger pawns. So I'll just put little arrows here. So these would be the ranger pawns for white, and these would be the ranger pawns for black. And the reason that I have the arrows going this way is because there's a lot less danger in pushing these pawns. You still have square weaknesses, you still can't push pawns just because, but you definitely want to rip open lines to your opponent's king. And, if we just look at the queen side here, black would love to bring it down these pawns and start really opening up lines and trying to attack the white king that's castled here. And likewise, white wants to do the exact same thing to black on the other side of the board. This is why when both sides castle in opposite directions, sometimes the games can get really sharp and very dangerous and all these pawn storms start. Now, if we were to go back and look at if you both castle in the same direction, this is not the case. Because here, yes, black's king is over here, but it's the same side of the board as white. And this also applies if both sides were to go queenside too, where you don't really want to be advancing your pawns. Because if I were to start advancing this, yes, I'm trying to attack the king, but notice that my king is over here too. And so in moving my pawns forward, I'm actually weakening my own king in the process. But if both sides castle in opposite directions, now my king is over here on this side of the board, and the king being on the other flank means that I can advance all these pawns, and my king is not weakened because my king is not over here. So this is kind of the introductory into kind of get us starting to think in the right mindset on what side we should castle. Now, of course, there's always going to be other variables. If one side, has a lot of pieces on one side of the board, say black has a bunch of pieces everywhere. Maybe they have a queen here, looking at this square. Maybe they have like a bishop eyeing this square. White might want to be a little careful about that and go, there's a lot of things aiming on the queen side. Maybe be best if I just went king side, just so I'm out of harm's way. Castling, the goal should be to mostly get your king to safety, and that should not be neglected. So with this being said, let's take a look at some examples And these are from all 5 of these examples are from my own games. But here we're only looking at what side we should castle on. We're not focused on the game itself. We are just focused on the mindset and the thought process. We should castle. What side should we castle if we castle at all? So let's take a brief look at that here. So here's my first example from a game that I played a long time ago. And so here, it is white to move. And so white can, literally in one move, they can castle kingside or queenside. So now they have a decision to make. What side of the board do they want to castle on? And so here, you can look at both. But we should look at the home pawns and the ranger pawns. Because here's black's home pawns. And depending on where white castles will determine theirs. So with that being said, we have to think, okay, well, what happens if white goes kingside? Well, if white castles kingside, then these will be the home pawns, and then they don't have to worry about too much. It looks pretty safe. Their king is tucked away. Looks like a normal game. However, if they castle queenside, notice this is much more dangerous. Yes, you have the rook and queen on the open file, semi-open file here, but we only have 2 home pawns here. Very dangerous. We have lost the c-pawn. And so white's king would be very vulnerable if we were to castle queenside. And because of this missing c-pawn, this one pawn, this little detail here, it would be very dangerous for us to castle this way. We might have problems potentially, maybe a rook on c8 long term, looking down our, file here. Maybe this diagonal, the queen and king, might be a problem. Maybe they might get a bishop to this diagonal somehow. Well, they've lost their bishop in this case, but they could get a queen on that diagonal or other things. It's just a lot of precautions that you would have to watch out for that you wouldn't have to deal with if you just castled kingside. And so in the game, I first improved my knight from the edge of the board. They made a normal move, and then we castled kingside, and we had a very safe position, and the game continued. So here I would say definitely castling kingside because we are missing a c-pawn, and we do not want an exposed king. So this is why we would castle kingside here. Now going to the next example. So here, now black is literally one move away from castling kingside, but do they want to go kingside or do they want to go queenside? Because, you could break the pin of this knight, and maybe you could develop the queen and then castle queenside. So what are the pros and cons of this? Because these decisions don't always come up one move away from castling. You have to think of this a few moves in advance. So looking at this position, I would say it's a lot safer to go kingside. And of course, we are literally one move away, so it saves us time. That is one very nice benefit. But here, notice that if the king were to castle queenside, the king would only be on c8 here. And again, we would have to worry about this pawn. It's a little bit more risky. It would take extra time to move the king to b8. And so this is taking too long for us. We have the bishop out, we have the queen out, then we have castling, maybe king to b8. That's already 4 moves. Versus here right now, we can just castle right away, and it's only 1 move, and our king is definitely pretty safe over here. Now, there's one little caveat here, and why I chose this example, is because a lot of players might be a little bit concerned because we have pushed this pawn. Notice that if black goes kingside here, these are their home pawns. And yes, this h-pawn is pushed. This is not on h7. We would love to have our pawn back on h7, have a lot more compact king, a little safer. Whereas if we go queenside, our pawns are unmoved. So, you have to evaluate the pros and cons here. And as long as you get thinking in the right mindset, that's the key to this. Because if you make the wrong judgment call, that's okay. You lose the game or you win, you analyze, you improve. But here, we have to make a judgment call. What side is safer to castling? And yes, this pawn has advanced. But once you get to a higher level, you realize, this isn't a problem. Like, let's say white would sacrifice here. I know that little move would scare a lot of players who are thinking, well, I'm now ripping open my king. Maybe it's reason I shouldn't castle that way. But this isn't really a problem because you're giving up a piece for a pawn. And we should easily be able to defend. We'll recapture. Maybe they'll bring pieces to try and attack us. And we just simplify. We'll just go knight to d4 here. And because they've sacrificed material, they really don't want to be trading off potential attackers. And, this knight probably has to give itself up because now we forked this bishop. They don't want to lose the bishop. So probably going to have to trade knight. We're going to trade, take back. And really, white has no attack. This knight's still defending, so the queen isn't going to come in with check. We also have the bishop here. And so even though black is pretty exposed with our king, they are of material, and they have a really safe position. Black is definitely winning here. So as long as you're aware of these ideas, it would be best if we had our pawn back on h7. That way we don't have to deal with these potential ideas on h6. But at the end of the day, it's still safer to castle kingside here. Alright, so now let's take a look at this third example here. So now this is from the King's Indian defense. This is the same-ish variation where white plays f3. And so here it is white to move, and we are faced with the decision. Just like last time, we are one move away from castling, but we could also get developed on the king side. And so we have to think, well, what side should we go to? Should we castle king side or should we go queen side? Similar to the first example, we are missing a c pawn. And so if we were to castle queen side, they might get a rook to c8. That looks very dangerous for us. Oftentimes in the Zamish, there's this idea of bishop to e3 and queen d2, really eyeing the king side, and oftentimes you'll want to castle queen side. You might want to do that, but that looks a bit risky here because we don't have this pawn and it's not the safest looking setup. Now, if you play this opening, the Zamish, with f3, if you're familiar with these patterns, you might also know that sometimes there's this pawn storm with, g4, h4, h5, these ideas, and you just play very aggressively, usually castling queenside. Now, those are some options that we have to think about. Now, if you were to say, why not just go like, say, knight g3, bring the bishop out, and castle kingside, I wouldn't say it's a terrible idea. I think it's playable. If I had to pick between queenside or kingside, I might very well just go kingside and just play it safe, develop your pieces, and you have a normal game and it looks okay. However, this is going to be a little different example where we might actually not want to castle because this was not that appealing because we do not have a c pawn. This is gone, so queenside castling is not so appealing here, and we would really like to go kingside, but this pawn is already pushed, and we don't really want this because now this diagonal is weak. Maybe they'll have like a queen check. Maybe they'll annoy us with other pieces. It's a bit dangerous for our king, and the whole point of castling is to have a safe king. So in this case, we can actually get away with what I played in the game, which is actually playing g4, and playing very aggressively with the idea of playing this pawn storm on the king side. Now, I know a lot of players are probably wondering, well, we can't just leave the king in the center, right? You've probably seen so many puzzles in games where if you stay uncastled, you lose very quickly. And often the case, yes, it is usually suicide to leave your king in the center that long. However, in this case, white has bought themselves a little bit of time. They cannot leave their king here forever. They have to make some decisions in the near future. But what really justifies this is here the center is closed. These pawns are locked up, and that is not going anywhere. And so the fact that the king is in the center actually isn't that terrible right now because the center is closed up. It's a very small detail, but black cannot rip open lines in the center. Now, this would be very, very different if, say, black had like the pawn back on e7, because maybe then they could push this pawn here, threaten to capture, I recapture, the e-file could open up, maybe they get a rook here, and my king is not going to last very long at all. However, because of the pawns here locked up in the center, we can survive a little longer in the center than normal. And in this case, I'm aggressively playing my pawn storm in such a way that they're going to have to react to so many threats. I can actually get away with leaving my king here for the short term. So I'll just play the next few moves of the game just to kind of briefly show that my king does indeed survive. You have to be careful. Here I ripped open this line, went knight f5, they brought the queen back, and then with rook g1 my opponent resigned because there's just such a strong attack they can't defend losing this piece that's pinned. And notice this would not be possible if I were to castle kingside. Here I went with rook g1, and my king would be on this square. And I really don't want that because that takes more moves to get out of the way. So in this rare example, we actually do not have to castle. Usually the only times you can get away with doing that is if the center is very closed, or a bunch of pieces have been traded off and you're kind of entering endgame already where your king wants to be in the center. Alright, so now let's go to the fourth example. Alright, so here in this position, again, white has the decision. Where do we want to castle? We can go, of course, queenside, something like queen d2 and castle in queenside. Or could we perhaps go kingside, something like bring the bishop out and then castle in. So in this case, I think there's playable ideas for each. But here I think there's really one good way to play it. And that good way, I'd say, is queen to d2. Now, what's the purpose of this? Well, similar to the King's Indian we looked at, this f3 move has been played. And if we look at the home pawns, if I were to, get queen d2 and castle queenside, my home pawns are pretty safe. The king just tucks away to b1, and it looks like it's fairly, protected. However, here, because we've pushed this f pawn, it's not as safe to castle because now this whole diagonal is exposed. And not only that, but if we were to imagine that our king is castled, so we bring the bishop out and castle, the king is on g1. Notice this entire diagonal is also weak. And so our king is actually very exposed just because this pawn is advanced from f2 to f3. So it's a very small pawn move. If this pawn was still back on f2, then maybe I could more comfortably castle kingside. But here, just because that little move, I think it's a lot safer to go queenside in this case. Now, maybe people recognize this opening, maybe not. Sometimes when you just plop right into a position, it looks kind of strange to start evaluating right away. But if we go back to the very start of the game, I think a lot of people will recognize this. This was the Sicilian, and this was the open dragon variation. And so here we played f3. Started this Yugoslav attack with bishop to e3. And this was the position that I gave, black castled. And now here, a lot of people will know the common ideas. It'll make a lot more sense. Oh, of course, now we go queen to d2, we castle queenside, and just like the King's Indian that we looked at with the Zamish, we might even start a pawn storm and starting to rip open lines in the opponent's king. Now, with that being said, I just want to show one other detail is back here. If we were to try and go kingside, what is the problem with that in this game? Because yeah, our king is a little open, but there's also one other problem that we have in this case, in this exact opening. So if we were to develop, say, bishop to e2, they develop their knight, we try and develop the queen, keep our options flexible, maybe go kingside, maybe not. The problem is black actually has the pawn d5. And it doesn't look like a big problem, but we'll want to take, they take back, we'll probably take back, they take back. And now all these trades have happened, but what has really happened? Not much, but there's a big problem here. White's king is still in the center. And so, black's king on the other hand is very safe, and they can afford to rip open the position. Now, in this case, it is a bit dangerous to have your king here. And yeah, we are one move away from castling, but just notice the pressure here. This knight is here, this bishop is here, this queen is here. Don't forget if this knight moves, then they have this bishop attacking b2, and that attacks the rook. It's just a very tricky position that I think objectively is probably close to equal, but it's not really something I want to deal with. I would much rather have my king castled already. And so for this reason, I think it's a little bit better if we were to go back. Instead of going kingside, take that little time, if we go queen d2, they play a move, and then we castle queenside, now we're in much better shape, because even though we do have to move the king probably at some point, our home pawns are very close to our king, and we have a pretty safe game. Alright, so now let's take a look at the last example here. In this position, we've traded down a bunch, black is up a pawn, however, it is white to move, their bishop is attacked, and so now they have to realize where should they move, and while white is moving, black has to be thinking where should they put their king, because this rook is already on e1, and this is an open file, so that king has to be very careful and has to make a decision very soon. So they did retreat bishop to g3, and now we think, well, where do I actually want my king? So I think the options are, well, of course, you could probably play something like this, maybe try and get castled kingside is probably one idea, and then the other idea is maybe you want to go queenside. Now, here, I don't really like either of those ideas, because the problem is, if we were to, bring this bishop out, there's just so many tactical ideas where this might be pinned because of the rook. Maybe they can even overload that, putting the bishop here. I recognize that the knight is defending the square, but just for tactical alertness, you have to be aware that they could try and overload the piece that way, and maybe they could win the piece on e7. You have to be very careful there. Now, additionally, even if we were to castle, the king gets on g8, but again, this pawn is pushed. And so that would be our home pawn. We do not want our home pawns like this, because now if the king is on g8, this entire diagonal is a bit weak, and we have to be very careful there. So I'm not really a huge fan of this. Now, what's the other idea? Well, maybe we could go queenside. Well, we have two nice home pawns here, but of course we are missing the c-pawn. And this is also very dangerous. The bishop is also already cutting in. We can't even tuck the king away to b8 because the bishop controls that square. So how are we defending our a7 pawn? So this isn't really ideal. Now, luckily, we have one very big asset in our favor, and that is we are up by one pawn. And so what can we do? Well, very simple. We want to trade, because if we can trade down, we'll reach an endgame where that pawn might be very decisive. So we doubled our pawns, which might be a weakness, later, and then I play a very instructional move, I'd like to say. Play just king d7. Now, in this case, we're not actually castling. We had one move before they gave a discovered check, so we probably didn't want to stay on the e-file. But here we just recognize it's an endgame. We want our king towards the center. Now, with that being said, if we were to find a way to castle kingside or queenside, notice that the king being here or here is a little further away from the center. And that means that we would be castling into safety, and then very shortly after we'd have to move the king back. Let's say we castle kingside, and then the king starts running back towards the center. It doesn't really make sense. It makes more sense to just ignore castling, put your king up, and there's a lot less danger here because white really doesn't have that many pieces around. This knight is very underdeveloped, and so are the rooks also on the back rank. So there's really no danger here. Just play king d7, and if they bring their king up as well, which is what happened in the game, I just went bishop to d6. And I ended up winning in the end game because, I can start contesting this open file, and we're just up a pawn. And, everything else is equal. And from there, it should be objectively a win if you just have the right technique and stay patient and just keep playing. But by all means, you wouldn't say that black is worse here, and they've solved the problem with castling. So those are 5 examples there, and a little bit of the thought process into deciding how I decide in what direction to castle. So just as a little bit of a review here, just one brief thing, if we go back to the original thing. So the big takeaway here are the home pawns versus the ranger pawns, and how safe you want your king. So in this case, if they were to castle, again, the home pawns are the pawns that are right in front of your castled king. These are the home pawns for white, and these are the home pawns for black. The home pawns want to stay home. They want to stay very close to their king and help offer protection from checks. Now, maybe at some point you might want to consider maybe making a little escape score for a king. That way you don't have to worry about back rank ideas, but that comes much later. Right now, we just want to keep these pawns very close to the king to help shield the king from checks. Now, on the other side of the board, you have the ranger pawns, where your king is not castled. So here, black is not castled on the queen side. These are black's ranger pawns, and white is not castled on the king side. So these are white's ranger pawns. Ranger pawns are the ones that you can more easily advance and not have to worry too much because their king is not on that side of the board. So I hope everyone found this a little instructional, and I will see you in the next chess video.